Welcome everyone to our first office hours of 2023. Happy New Year to all.
Happy New Year.
And we're excited to invite you all to join us for office hours this year. We have lots of guests planned and exciting things to talk about with Hyperscore. But today we have Lisa Pierce Goldstein and Cece joining us. Cece, want to take it away?
Oh, of course, we have our wonderful Chief Technology Officer, Peter Torp, and I am the Director of Education. And our guest today is Lisa Pierce Goldstein. And we first met Lisa when she was a pilot teacher for us in the fall of 2021. And I actually think, Lisa, your project may have extended into the spring of that school year because you weren't ready for a specific project yet. But we're so excited to hear about what you did with the beta pilot project. But I think that something I want everybody to know is what a unique career you've had, which was something just as entrancing what you've done with Hyperscore as the many facets of and what you've done with music. So with that said, can you tell us a little about yourself, Lisa?
Sure. Happy New Year, everyone, and hello. I'm coming to you live from Brighton, Massachusetts, where I find my primary form of employment as a speech language pathologist for the Boston Public Schools. Excuse me. But that's not all. I'm also a classically trained singer, and I have for many years combined my my work as a speech pathologist with music, and for the last 7 years, it's 2023, so this will be my 8th year. I have been a lead partner teacher collaborating with the Boston Lyric Opera in using a curriculum called Music Words Opera that I've used with my students every year. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that more in detail, but I'll just tell you a little bit about how I sort of started doing that. I became a speech pathologist in 2001. Oh, actually, today is my speech pathologiversary. I started my very first job on January 3rd, 2001. And, my use of music in treatment with my students was sort of experimental for a while. We listened to a lot of music. Eventually, a couple years later, I decided to try and do a little mini choir and have my students sing one song for graduation. And, I've worked with students with complex communication needs, meaning many of them are non-speaking or minimally speaking and using augmentative and alternative communication as their primary means of communication. So, I wasn't sure how all of this would go, but, the music interventions were always very popular with my students and they always loved them. And once I moved to Boston, I found myself wanting to do something more structured. I wondered about, could I put together an adapted music class? Because there wasn't really anything available that addressed the learning needs of my particular students. We did have music teachers in the school, but they didn't have a lot of training in working with students with complex needs. So then the summer of 2014, BLO's week-long professional development in Music Words Opera appeared on our professional developments platform. And I was like, yeah, why not? So I did it. And almost immediately I saw that this, anything story-based feeds right into the kind of work I do with my students in terms of a lot of the language goals, especially in a school-based setting. I'm always working on vocabulary and understanding and describing elements of stories, anything that ties in with literacy curriculum, and, with students' ability to describe the world around them. So I saw that it was perfect. And then the first year was, sort of my roller coaster ride of deciding to try and adapt it for my students with complex communication needs. And it was terrifying, but it was very successful, and I've been doing it ever since. Absolutely. So the first part of the curriculum really is learning about opera, what it is. In past years, I've had them watch and study a full-length piece over, a couple of months so that we can break it down. And then in the winter and spring, we get into more of the composition and creation process. And I start that with, or we build up to it with a series of lessons in just very basic musical element skills. So we do some lessons on sound and silence. So we work on stop and go. We work on loud and quiet. We work on fast and slow. We work on high and low, and combining those. And then, as we were talking about before we started, I sort of build that into music and emotion, or music and mood. And so we take that vocabulary, that musical vocabulary that we have built up, and we take that into, first a couple of listening lessons where I bring in a whole, range of tunes that I think exemplify what we would kind of conventionally understand as happy music, happy sounding music, or sad. And then, I'll play a piece and I'll give them some choices, which feeling did you think that, how did you feel? Or what do you think that the mood of that piece was? And say, it was the happy. And then we talk about, was it loud or quiet? Was it fast or slow? Was it smooth or bumpy? What were the elements there that kind of gave it its feeling? And then we also talk about types of music that are used in different settings, the mood of music that might be used, at a sporting event, or, a wedding, or a family party, or a funeral, or so we do spend a couple of weeks on that, so that they have that kind of that vocabulary and that understanding of how manipulating these different elements in a piece of music can create a mood or a feeling, so that they have the vocabulary to make these choices as we go into the composition process. So sort of the most exciting day for me anyway of the whole process is the day when we vote on our opera topic. So I spend, a couple weeks keeping my ear to the ground and sort of figuring out what my students are interested in, what they're watching. Are there, books in their classroom curriculum that have been particularly engaging to them? I confer with their teachers, and we narrow it down to 4 choices, and then everyone votes. So every stakeholder in the class gets a vote. Each student gets a vote, the teacher gets a vote, however many paraprofessionals are in the class get a vote, I get a vote. And it's a very exciting day. And so whatever, has the most votes is what we write our topic on. Then we spend a couple of weeks doing some story grammar work on the story. What are the story elements? What's the plot? What are the steps in the plot? Who are the characters, et cetera, et cetera. And then very gradually we start writing some musical numbers. So, it may start with, if we're doing it on I've had some classes where we were doing it on a book. And, if it's a book with fairly straightforward text, then it's very simple to adapt that and start writing, the pieces. If there's no text, or if it's, like last year we did an opera based on Among Us, the video game. So we had to, I had to kind of get creative and think about it. Once I figured out that it was basically Werewolf in Space, the parlor game, then, I kind of put together, a structure. And with that particular class, you know, I had them work on creating an Among Us theme that would recur throughout the piece. So, you know, something that I've gotten into a lot the last sort of 3 or 4 years, especially, and what brought me to interest in Hyperscore is that I've included a lot more digital technology, because, you know, there's a lot that can be done with it. It's accessible for students who don't play instruments. You know, it's and I've worked with you know, with the smart instruments on GarageBand have been great. I've used spectrums, and what was the and we did our main thing on Thumb Jam. And the thing I like about Thumb Jam is that you can reduce the number of notes. So, you know, they had 5 notes in I think I had a pentatonic scale. And so, you know, I had each student or little group of students come up with, you know, little snippets of 3 notes for Among Us. And from there, we just kind of wove that together to create the theme. So that's kind of, you know, and I've used that technique with a variety of numbers, like we did a Superman versus Godzilla several years ago. And so I used the same principle with Tokyo. Our opening song was Tokyo. And so we studied all about Tokyo, all the landmarks and the places you'd go if you were a tourist and what you'd eat. And then we created a little musical motif for Tokyo and you know, made this little 3 repetition of Tokyo chunk that, you know, we repeated that a couple times. And then we had a line about one of the places, you know, a couple places you might like to see in Tokyo. And then the little chunk of Tokyo would come back again until, you know, we had a whole song. So in the last couple years, initially I was working more on composing melodically with them. The last couple of years, I've done some harmonic composition. So that's when I started using the smart instruments in GarageBand, which is also great because I can just limit the number of chords they have. And so we did one of our operas last year was on The Mandalorian, because they were all crazy about Baby Yoda. And so I had a couple groups where I could just, you know, give them 4 or 5 chords in, you know, D minor and have them come up with, you know, a pattern of 3. And we built songs around, you know, those combinations. So that's a little bit about, you know, the approach to composition.
I think everybody would be really interested in the fact that you were one of the few beta teachers that were actually working with children with special needs in Hyperscore. And we had talked many times about potential things that we could do to the program, to Hyperscore. More like you were talking about how you could limit it to 5 notes in Thumb Jam. And Peter and I have talked about something called toggles, where you can turn things off and on. If you want to talk a little bit about your experience in Hyperscore, and then kind of what you see it do for your students with special needs. What would you like to see the shape going forward?
Yeah, so last year was my last year at my previous school, which closed at the end of the year. So previously I'd worked with 3 what are called ABA strand classes. And those are small, substantially separate classes with students mostly on the autism spectrum, but, you know, with complex communication needs. And then I would also work with 1 inclusion class. And I think that Hyperscore would have been ideal to use in the inclusion class, but because the school was closing, enrollment was way down, and basically my entire caseload was the ABA strand. And those are students that really need a limited set of choices. I did present them with, we did play around with Hyperscore several times with several groups, and I actually loaded it on my iPad, and I had, I have an Apple Pencil, and they really had fun, like, using the Apple Pencil to dot notes all over the place. But my experience was that it was too much choice for this particular group of students. They had fun with it for sure, and they definitely understood the concept of dotting the notes and pressing play and listening to, what it sounded like. A couple of them were even able to change the instrument sounds, but working on having them develop any, sort of finite chunk of notes, or understanding the concepts of longer or shorter notes was very challenging. However, we did have some very interesting sound collages. I had one student who was very, very excited about filling up the entire screen with notes. So, and I've seen, that happens too when I've used the Song Maker on, on the Chrome Music Lab. They just color in everything, and then you play it, and it's like chunk, 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 chunk. So that's, so that was mostly how I used it with, my students last year. This year, I'm working with inclusion classes again. And I think that my students this year will be much more interested and able to do more, let's compose let's, do a theme in a measure here. And can you extend that note here? And, let's make it go higher. And so, I'm going to, right after we get back this week, I am going to try and get them to do 4 on the floor on the Chrome Music Lab Song Maker, and, maybe a couple of stepwise things, and see how that goes.
So then do you think your progression will be given the basics using the Chrome Lab, and then see what they can do with Hyperscore?
Yes, that's, I think I really, what I have done in the last couple of years is introduce a few different tools, a few different digital tools, and see what takes, see what they take to, what what they most enjoy using, and usually it's fairly clear, fairly quickly, what a particular group of students, really sort of hooks into. And like I said, I've used a couple of tools with particular classes. Like Among Us, we used spectrums to do one thing. We used the, I can't remember what it's called, on GarageBand, where you get the sound packs. Yeah, I guess it's the sound packs. They had a couple of space-related sound packs, so we used those for, the music when you get ejected from the spaceship and kicked out into space. And I did some sort of more traditional, like, digital keyboard stuff with, with a couple of the students in that class too. So yeah, like I said, I will introduce a few different tools, and I think this particular class will definitely, have the skills to be able to access what Hyperscore has to offer.
Just to circle back earlier when you were saying that you first introduced kids to some opera, I was curious, like, what are good works from the repertoire that kids respond to and that are kid appropriate? Because some operas, like,
it's a really good question. And I've worked in K-8, and there would be much more available for me to use if I worked with high school students, because a lot of opera is is pretty dirty and pretty violent, and pieces that are appealing to kids are much more limited. But what I've done, I always start with the good old-fashioned Bugs Bunny cartoons. The beginning of the year, I do what is opera, and we just basically describe it. And if I can get them to say opera is when you sing a story, that's my goal. Is to have them understand that. And then we talk about how there, most countries and cultures of the world have their own form of sung drama, sung stories. So, there are all sorts of different forms of opera around the world. We're looking at European opera. We're also looking at a little bit, I talk about how American musical theater is kind of our version, a homegrown American version of opera, even though, musical theater and opera people will say that they are completely different, and here's the reason why. And I mostly agree with that, but for the sake of my students, I try to keep it, in those bite-sized chunks. So we start with, after we've talked about what is opera, we spend a little time talking about comedy and tragedy. And so then we start watching the Bugs Bunny and other cartoons. We watch What's Opera Doc, which is a clear comedy. We watch, we watch The Rabbit of Seville, which is a comedy. What's Opera Doc is a tragedy. That's the one where Elmer Fudd it's the Wagner, and Bugs Bunny ends up, Bugs Bunny's always dressed in drag and gets Elmer Fudd to fall in love with him, and but he ends up smiting Bugs Bunny with lightning, and Bugs Bunny dies, and then the really big one that we watch is The Whale That Wanted to Sing at the Met, which, if you don't know it, it's a cartoon from 1940. Nelson Eddy does all the voices. And it's about this whale that can sing, and the impresario of the Metropolitan Opera is convinced that this whale has swallowed opera singers, and so he goes out to rescue the opera singers and ends up harpooning and killing the whale.
Oh, no.
So it's a very clear tragedy. But and you can find it on YouTube. It's about 15 minutes long. So that's how I get everybody into it. And then we've watched a whole bunch of different full-length pieces. Hansel and Gretel is, sort of the big obvious one. I've used the 1982 Live from the Met with Frederica von Stade and Judith Blagan and Rosalind Elias, who's phenomenal as the witch. With one of my more mature classes, I did Aida one year. That was kind of a lot. I've also done Elixir of Love. For Leonard Bernstein's centennial, we watched West Side Story. And he grew up in Boston and was educated in Boston Public Schools. So that was, a nice tie-in. And then I also did the Oliver Knussen Where the Wild Things Are, which was a big hit. It's not easy to find it. I kind of had to, get the DVD and a DVD drive to attach to my computer, and but the kids really loved it. And it's, I'm finding it challenging because I'm finding that I want to, and then last year, actually, Washington Opera collaborated with Mo Willem and did a piece on called Slopera, based on his book, I Really Like Slop, with Piggy and Gerald, and the kids really like that too. So I'm finding with elementary school a real need for sort of shorter, more like one act pieces with casts that look like them, and that are stories that are relevant to, a more modern audience, which I think is what we're doing when we compose our operas. And I think that some of the opera companies are getting it and are producing pieces like that, like Houston Grand Opera just did a snowy day, but they're not streaming it. So, it's very frustrating. I think my students would love it, but I can't get a hold of it to show them. And, the Kennedy Center is not streaming Slopra this year either. So, there are some, I see the needs, and there are some pieces that I'd love to get my hands on. And, I think that's where we all come in. That's our job, is to create new works for new audiences. And I love that we're in an age of participation. Like, when I was in school and in music school and everything, there were the composers, and then there were the rest of us. And now music curriculum, one of the has standards of students composing and students participating in this process. And I think that's amazing. I think we're in a new era of ownership and, integration of everyone into the process. Excuse me.
I hope so. Well, that's certainly what we're advocating.
I love your approach to getting kids to think compositionally by first listening, but not just the story. I mean, there's the story part of what you're doing, but also the listening musically. And it reminds me a bit of something that we've talked a lot about with the city symphony projects that we've done, where kids listen to their environment and try to produce that musically. But you were saying about creating new works and performing them. I'm curious about what the performance side of these works are once you've composed them with your kids.
Every single piece we have written has been performed before a live audience. So at this point, I think I've done 24 mini operas, and they have all been performed live. So, I'm a very sort of regimented person. So my students are always really well rehearsed. And, I try and make, since my students do have sensory needs and the need for predictability, music actually helps that. Since they know the pieces, and, we use a lot of repetition and stuff. But I, make sure I rehearse my students very, very, very much, so they know what they're doing, very automatically by the time, and by that time the staff is so into it, and, creating costumes and things like that. So yeah, we did one of our pieces last year was, we wrote an original Shaun the Sheep episode. And the day before the performance, I walked in, and since we were all cleaning stuff out, since we had to leave the school building, and the teacher and the classroom paras had spent a couple of days just using whatever scraps were hanging out in the classroom. And they, I walked in, and there were, 2 cows and a bunch of chickens. So, everybody gets very creative as it approaches performance time. And, typically with, and we've had performances in front of, typically for my ASD students, I try and find a modest size space, and we have an invited audience. Although we've had pretty big audiences for those performances. With my inclusion kids, one year, one group performed at the BPS Arts Festival on the Boston Common. We had a little festival with another school that was doing the curriculum that came in, and so we had 2 pieces.
Do you know anything about how your kids reflect on these experiences as they go forward in their education and lives?
That's a really, really good question. For my students, in the ABA strand classes, I have done like exit tickets using Boardmaker, which is a picture symbol software program. And I usually have multiple choice using those pictures, our opera was about, they have 4 choices and they have to choose the right one. I played the role of, I had fun doing, so that's how I do it with that. With my inclusion students, I use the exit tickets that come with the curriculum and that BLO provides. And usually there's just a lot more discussion, and the students remember the songs for years. I've had, I work in my last school, I worked with my ABA strand ASD students were grades 4 through 8. So the older ones would go on to high school, and I would, at a staff departmental meeting, I would run into, OTs or other providers that work with some of the students, and they would tell me that these kids are still singing a couple of these songs 2 and 3 years later. So it definitely stays with them. One thing I didn't have a chance, I really wondered about with a few years ago with one of my inclusion classes, we did Nasreen's Secret School, which is a book about girls being forbidden to get education in Taliban-run Afghanistan in the 1990s. And suddenly that became much more relevant with the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan and the Taliban taking power again and stripping education away from girls once again. And I am not with any of the students who were in that particular production anymore. I am still working with the teacher, and she and I have talked about it a lot and wondered, if our students who were in that, if they were even aware, of what was going on in Afghanistan. I have thought a lot about that. And I wonder if the students who participated in that were able to make the connection.
So we had started, June got us doing a workshop where we get together with people, write a piece of music and introduce the idea of composition to might not necessarily be doing that. So do you mind talking for a second about what ended up happening that first time that you came to the second Saturday composition?
I really come to composition late. I certainly wasn't, taught it. And really up to this point, I have always done words first. I've always done my text first. I've never done music first. I've never done it the other way. Mostly because I really feel like I need the structure of the words to generate the musical ideas. So having someone to guide me through the process of, composing just music without words or without something to hang it on to, I think, I think is still something that I need. I need that structure and that driver. Maybe at some point I'll be able to generate ideas with myself. However, I will say that a program like Hyperscore that allows you to create the melody and then the percussion in a separate sphere and then add the harmony, I think really kind of removes a lot of that internal pressure and fear that I feel of not being, a trained composer, just kind of going on my knowledge of music theory and all of that. And all of the yelling that I've done, at the wall as I taught myself Sibelius and, um,
Well, it was funny because sitting in your car waiting for your son to come out of basketball
Yeah.
practice, and Peter, I need a melody. And all of a sudden you open your mouth and out came the 20 note series. And Peter, with his incredible ability to do what you've done, and that became the motif that we created the whole piece. And I don't know if you recall that particular thing, but it was like, we couldn't have paid you to do any more than that's exactly what we wanted. Somebody there, it just came right out of your mouth. Do you have music floating around?
I've gotten better at it for sure. Over the last several years of, writing music, but I still really think of myself more of a singer-songwriter than a composer. Really still the text comes first and I hang the music on that. However, as I was able to do that day, if I get a particular structured suggestion, I can come up with something.
Well, you raised a good point though, because composers do start with the words first. And that's something we can explore in another, future second Saturday, is come up with some words and then set that to music. I mean, there's no right way, right? Or one way to do things. And
Right.
That's one that many people will probably relate to. I think the point is it's so helpful to have something to start with, like a little bit of grit to build the pearl on.
But that could also be, what you were saying about how does it feel? What is the mood that you want to create, or what is the event that this is for? At least gives you something to start with. I think that a completely blank canvas is, as we've talked about in the past, office hours, really difficult because there's too many choices. And that kind of ties in with this idea of constraints, and limiting choices can be creatively positive.
Once we kind of start talking about conventions in music, I realize how much sort of inborn, or not inborn, but learned sort of cultural knowledge we have in terms of musical structures and musical sounds. And once we tap into that, it's a little easier to just come up with something. It's not a totally blank slate. We do have, everything that we've been hearing and the harmonic and melodic structures that we've been hearing our whole lives to tap into.
Sounds like when you work with your students to come up with a subject for the opera, that you don't just throw open the whole library and say, pick anything out of here. You have some process where you.
Yeah. And usually, sometimes it's hard, but there are usually a couple things that the students are really interested in. It's just a matter of, narrowing them down and presenting them in a way that they'll vote for the thing that everybody wants to do. Although that hasn't always happened. I was sure we were going to be doing an opera on Peppa Pig one year, and the students voted for Scooby-Doo instead, much to everyone's shock and surprise, and perhaps relief.
And this is more of a philosophical thing, but do you have them record communication devices, and then when they're performing, do they perform from their device? It's their cue and they hit the button and their response comes out of their communication.
Yes, I have used a number of AAC technologies in performance. Interestingly, many of my students who are non-speaking or minimally speaking can sing pretty well. That's been very interesting. However, I have had a couple of students where I had a student with touch chat, and you can record right into the program. And so I recorded all of the lines for, several songs so that he could, sing along using his device. I've also used Super Talkers, which is a static display device to do harmony. Like I recorded, like I used 2 of them, and I had somebody else record, the harmon, a different, note of the chord. And I had students, activate them to create vocal harmony. And I've used single message devices to produce sound as well. So yeah, I've definitely used AAC technology as part of these performances.
Someone like you who has given us feedback and with your students is the perfect person to be talking to us about what could technology do for your students with special needs and your students in your classes as well. And we're just so thankful to have that opportunity to work with you and get ideas on how Hyperscore could develop and do more for your students.
I'm very happy to be connected with you guys too, because I love to have more tools, in my toolbox too, and for my students to have more tools.
Okay, so thank you for being with us this evening, Lisa, and we wish you a great new school year tomorrow when you go back to work.
Yes, thank you, and to everybody else.